Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do. To educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to today's show. So today I have Matthew Paetz on the show. And funny story about this, we were just talking. So we have a very close mutual friend, Chase Tuning, who I have been on his podcast. He has been on my podcast. Many of you know him. And he had been telling me for a few weeks, you got to get Matthew on your show. You guys talk about all the same stuff, speaking about suffering being a source of meaning and sort of pain being a path to purpose. And so I was just like, hell yeah, let's get him on. I love these conversations. And so here we are. The thing to know is that Matthew and I don't know each other that well. So as you get to know Matthew, I'm getting to know Matthew. And so we're going to have just sort of a really nice discussion here about what I would call the most important aspect of being a next level human, which is taking this idea that life is suffering, life is change, life is anything but predictable. And we need to be able to take that suffering and that pain and choose to do with it something of value. And so that's where I want to start this discussion with you, Matthew. But before we get into it, man, why don't you just give us a background on sort of your work, where you're coming from, and sort of how you got to where you are.
Absolutely. So my story's layered, and before we get into all that, I think it's what just came up for me, as you mentioned, is we're just getting to know each other, right? Quite literally, people are watching us have our first real conversation. Yep. And I think there's a lot of beauty in the example of, being next level, being able to connect on similar topics, coming from different backgrounds, and people get to see it in real time. I think this is it's going to be a lot of fun. So, but to answer your question, so my background is in psychology, but what I focus on more specifically are early childhood survival patterns and root cause emotional trauma, right? I'm a firm believer that life is happening for you, not to you, but not just in some, Instagram quippy, tweet kind of way, but really the basis of the work that I'm doing in my own life first and foremost, but, holding space and supporting others to do as well is to be able to identify the wisdom and the value that comes from our pain, right, or our deepest suffering, and how we get to leverage those experiences to create a future that not only we deserve, but one that feels purposeful, right? I'm a firm believer that purpose isn't something we find, but rather it's something we create and then connect with, right? It's like fitness. You don't find fitness, you create your wellness, you create your health, and then you must maintain it. I believe purpose operates in the exact same way. And we're in real time. Yep. Got planes going over us. So all that to be said, a lot of my work, it's not just a regurgitation of some fancy books that I once read, right? But rather it stems from a life being lived, and those layers for me specifically, the reason why I focus on early childhood development and our root cause emotional trauma is because that is my story, right? And if I were to give you and the listeners kind of the cliff notes of that, the basis of my story started with sexual abuse from an older male, right? Which, from that experience lasted nearly 5-6 years of my childhood. And from that experience, it led into, struggles around identity, struggles around sexuality, struggles around, masculinity and all these things. Growing up in a farm town in rural Indiana, there were some of those traditional things that were in conflict with my my personal experiences. So a lot of shame, a lot of guilt that came from that. That shame and guilt eventually presented itself in forms of, very promiscuous lifestyle. Became an escort for a while. That led to substance abuse, cocaine more specifically, which eventually led to call it my rock bottom, or my birth, if you will, which was a morning where on a cocaine crash, I almost committed suicide. When I say almost, I say it because the method in which I was going to choose, there wasn't going to be a second chance. Right. So it's more specifically at a loaded handgun. And there's layers to this story that now I speak on. But just to kind of go into that right away, I learned two very valuable lessons that specific morning. And that was first and foremost, I didn't want my life to end, but rather I wanted my life as I knew it to end. And at that time, I didn't know another way. Right. And I say I didn't know, but in fact, if I go even deeper, if I'm even more honest about it, I in fact did know another way, but I was terrified, right, to face it head on, to take ownership, take responsibility, be vulnerable, and not only get the support, but share my story with those who I loved and who I feared it would affect. But that leads to the second thing that I learned in hindsight, which was that if I was willing to go that far, and when I say that far, my partner, Allison, who's my teammate, lifelong love of my life. But at that time, we were in a very toxic place. She actually witnessed me load the weapon on FaceTime. Right? So I was in a complete spiral. I projected that onto her. And then eventually she got my mother and my sister. So my mother, my sister, and my girl, Allison, were on a three-way call, the three most important people in my life. Three most important women, and they had to bear witness to that raw moment, feeling completely hopeless, not knowing even where I was, but knowing what the situation I was in, knowing I was on a drug crash, knowing I had a loaded weapon in my hand, like all of these moments. And to go that far, again, brings me to the second piece, which is if I was willing to go that far, which clearly I was, because I was doing it, then I no longer had the luxury of fear. Right? And what I mean by that is I could no longer be more afraid of my truth than I was my own death. Right? I could no longer be more afraid of my insecurities or what I thought was flaws than I was my willingness to put the three most important lives through that morning, right, and project that onto them. So a lot of my work really stems from creating a safe place to feel messy. Right. And as I share these details, I also want to just explain that, it's my story, but it's not about me. Right. We can only speak from our experiences, our truths, and our perspectives. So when I share my story, I don't share it for those who it will shock or offend. Right. Because there's still more layers to this. But rather, I share my story for those who are still too afraid to share their own. Right, who feel like they're completely in the dark, completely alone, completely misunderstood. Right, so my hopes in having conversations such as these is to give anyone out there that feels like there's not another way, no one will understand, they don't get it. Right, there are people out there that do understand, that do get it, and have and know how to kind of face these things head on. So if you let me go, I'll keep going.
Yeah, no, I mean, it sets the stage, right? Because here we have this, coming up with someone and talking to someone who's been through some of the most difficult things that, people can go through. Like this is the stuff of movies, right? To give a contrast here. And I have a couple things to say here, the reason why I'm contrasting. So my deepest pain was an affair, my affair, cheating on my wife. Now, for you all listening, here's what's interesting about this, and I want to get your take on this, Matthew, is that what ends up happening is when you hear a story like Matthew's, right, which is horrifying in sort of the extreme of it is, and then you hear a story like mine, and then you hear somebody who, I don't know, was bullied at school, right, and you have these three different, sort of traumas. Right. And by the way, my childhood trauma, too, is I had a mom who was amazing and wonderful, but also very volatile. So I grew up learning to distrust women in a sense, because one minute she was there and loving me, and the next minute she was kind of freaking out. And so the point of this is that when we all have sort of these traumas, we all perceive them in different ways. Right. And so I want to get your take just a little bit on this. When people hear your story, like immediately when I'm hearing it, I'm like, shit, man. I mean, that is just crazy. This is stuff of movies. And so the first thing I want to sort of get your take on is, how do people usually react to hearing this level of difficulty and pain? And what is your take on this idea of like your pain versus my pain versus someone else's pain? And how do you reconcile this, right? Because I could see someone talking to you and being like, oh, Matthew's pain is exactly like mine, therefore I want to talk to him. Or it's like, that's a little bit extreme for me. So, maybe Matthew isn't the person I want to listen to. My take really quickly is that, in a sense, it's the way we perceive the pain. My pain may be as difficult as yours, even though it's just a hangnail in sort of the, cultural, stream of different pains. And so I just want to get your take on that. How do people take this when you're upfront and transparent about this, because you've made it your life work? So in a sense, you've said, I have pain, I'm going to turn it into purpose to help others. How do they normally react to that? And then what is your take on this idea of comparing pain?
Oh, you open up a phenomenal door here. So first, it's interesting. I've not actually been asked how other people really perceive it, but that in fact was one of the most difficult seasons as I began to share my story more openly, right? To be it strangers, be it clients, be it family, friends, whomever. And it's funny because my fear was that, if I share this, I will be rejected, right? I'll be judged, I'll be ridiculed, I'll be all these things, right? Abandoned, if you will. And what I found was that my story, once I shared it, would often dominate a conversation. And that experience left me feeling shame, guilt. Like, that's why I open this up and say it's my story, but it's not about me. Right? It took me a long time to understand that, because I stopped sharing in many cases because of the way people were responding. I was like, oh, this is too much. So again, it's the pain was too much for me, but my story is too much for most. So I'm just going to sit here with this and just kind of figure it out. Right. But what that led me to, and both my own understanding, my own experience, as well as my education, was that, going back to what you were asking around, how do we perceive each other's pains? Now, I think it's extremely important for people to recognize that, trauma doesn't understand context. Right? And when I say trauma, I also mean just life experiences. They don't even have to be quote unquote traumatic, right? But experience doesn't understand context, because your nervous system doesn't understand context, right? It only understands, your perception of the experience that you were facing. So, for example, I could ask you, Jade, like, do you know how it feels to be insecure?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so do I.
Yeah. What that looks like for me is just what I told you about, my mom yelling one day, I'm going to leave. I'm leaving. She was just frustrated, but I thought she was really leaving. Right. So that's what it feels like to me.
Right. So insecurity, like, even without sharing more, there's obviously many layers to this. Right. But you being able to say, yes, I understand how it feels to be insecure. Right. Do you know how it feels to be scared?
Yeah.
Right? Do you know, like, I'm sitting here meeting you for the first time, like, do you know how it feels to call it this is a big story in my life, right? To feel like a coward. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So again, I'm using big things here to drive home the point, which is we've not shared, what has made you feel like a coward in your past, right? Or what made you feel fear, right? But I can relate to feeling like a coward. I can relate to being scared. I can relate to being insecure, right? And when we sit here and have a conversation about how these situations made us feel versus what created those experiences, right? Because the human being, and obviously you know this very well, like we're emotional creatures with the ability to express logic. We're not logical creatures with the ability to express emotion, right? And what we often do in our society is we use the context as a form of competition, right? And there's one or two sides to this. Like you said, someone may be hearing my story and you'd be able to say like, that guy doesn't know shit. He's not been through anything I've been through, right? Or they may, hear your story, someone else's story, and say like, "Oh, who am I to feel the way that I do? I've not been through anything this person has," right? And then they discredit themselves. Right? But both approaches are completely disempowering, completely, creates a disconnection, right? Versus being able to understand and relate to and connect with, oh, I know how it feels to be insecure. I know how it feels to make decisions because I felt ashamed, right? I felt inadequate, inferior, weak, whatever it is, right? So when we allow ourselves, I believe, when we allow ourselves to identify the emotional experience versus compete over context, right? This is how someone in fitness, for example, if you have someone that would like to lose a significant amount of weight. And then on the other side, you have someone that would like to gain a significant amount of weight, right? Both of them are completely insecure about how they feel about themselves, assuming, right, for context.
Yeah.
Right. So asking either of them to go to the gym and talk to someone like yourself for the very first time, completely intimidated. They're overwhelmed, right? They both feel like they don't belong for whatever reason, right? But if they were to look at each other and say, you don't understand my pain, you don't understand what it feels like to hate your body, you don't understand what it feels like to be afraid to be seen. Meanwhile, they're like, what do you, yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Right. Why I'm afraid of those things may be different, but that experience is identical. It's the same. So I think it's extremely important in this and working with others now in a supportive relationship, coaching or mentoring, to be able to hear their story and hold space, not for the details they may share, but rather the ways in which those experiences made them feel about themselves, right? Meet them in that space. And then my intention with being so candid with my story is to show too that it's, as uncomfortable as it may be, it's safe to be real. It's safe to be transparent. It's safe to be like authentic with your story, right? With who you are. But yeah, to make this a little cleaner, I believe it's more important that we identify I call emotional themes, right? Feeling like a coward, feeling weak, feeling insecure, feeling not good enough, right? Feeling shame, whatever it may be. These are emotional themes. And when we can understand the emotional theme that we're experiencing and put a label on it, right, that provides us the ability now, or the understanding, to be able to connect with others who may have experienced something completely different, but are going through the same thing.
I love this, man. So let me just throw some things at you here, and then for you guys listening. So I love this idea. If I'm hearing you correctly, it's almost like this thing where it's like, okay, first of all, you have to move from like the idea of victimhood, right? In a sense, I think, and this is a question and just a comment, and it's meant for you to agree, disagree, discuss. But I oftentimes think that moving from victim to ownership, right? And maybe you could say victim to victor, really to me goes, I have got to simply take what has happened and just own it, right? So just be like, this happened, which sounds like a little bit of what you're saying, but you're also saying something really interesting here, because then you say, okay, sure, this happened. But from that point, then we have to say, let's forget about all the details and let's just go into the feeling of what it is, which becomes a little bit more tangible for us in a sense, or maybe more usable in a sense. And from there, this is the third part in my mind. Only at that point can we begin to start to get the lessons out of it. Now, I don't know if this is if you feel this same trajectory and you see this the same way, but I see it very clearly, at least as I'm listening to you. And I just think I want to voice it, have the listeners hear it, then have the expert kind of say, yeah, Jade, I see it the same way, or I don't see it the same way, or you're missing this point. But I go, awareness of detail, sure, this happened. Second, what is the actual feeling that keeps coming up? And by the way, these things to me show up in patterns again and again in our lives, the same feelings over and over again, the same patterns over and over again. That's when you know you haven't cleared this trauma in my mind. And then the next thing is, okay, how do I learn and move past this idea? So what are your thoughts about that? Do I have that correct, or would you say it's a little different?
No, I think you're spot on. And the way that I describe this, right, is I love to say that a superpower that we all have access to is responsibility. We all have access to responsibility, right? But I think it's extremely important to recognize that there's a difference between responsibility and fault, right? What happened to you may not have been your fault, but that is now your responsibility. Right? Like if someone were to come and leave a baby on your doorstep and just run away, right? That baby may not have been your fault, but in that moment, it is now your responsibility, right? So it's the same with our life experiences. When you talk about victimhood, I feel like, we use fault or blame, right, as a strategy to protect ourselves. Right? Because maybe taking responsibility, maybe it's a little too heavy in this moment. Maybe we don't have the proper support around us to help us navigate this experience. So it's safer for us to just blame others and put the responsibility on them to fix it for us. And we get to stay in what we identify as a victim space. Right. But I think it's extremely important for anyone that says they just want to have more control, or they want to be able to, have greater impact or greater influence. You can't have either of those things without responsibility. Right, so you must be willing to take responsibility for, but not fault. Right. I think there's a huge difference there now.
And it's hard, man. I mean, that's a hard thing to do for many people, because it basically says, you know what, regardless of what happened to me, now I got to fix it. And I don't want to fix it. You did it. You fix it. You say you're sorry.
Yeah. And how about this? What if we, instead of fixing it, what if we learned how to leverage it? Right. For example, like in the beginning, I literally almost took my life because of my story. Now, I wouldn't let you take my story, even if it cost my life. Like it's everything to me. It's become my greatest asset and something I cherish so deeply, because it's afforded me the opportunity to really go deep into a human experience. Right. I see it. I kind of, when we talk about stories, in our personal stories, I like to look at them like this. So are you a fan of or have any interest in like detective movies or shows?
Yeah, I love the Sherlock Holmes.
Okay, so you'll understand this reference, I'm sure. So there's undercover detectives, right? What does it mean to go undercover, right? In your opinion, what does that mean if a detective has gone undercover?
Yeah, they're essentially hiding themselves to out somebody else or to fix a problem, but they're definitely acting differently, being a different human.
And they've gone undercover in what? Like where? What group specifically are they undercover in?
Yeah, they're usually in the criminal world, or people who are doing the bad things, quote.
Right. So carrying this forward just a little bit now. So you've gone undercover with the criminals, the bad things. Like, did you know they were criminals to choose to go undercover with them?
Yeah, I mean, normally that's the way it works if you're a detective.
You just don't pick a random group and say, I'm going to go undercover for a couple of years and see if they're up to something.
Exactly.
All right. So to know that they're criminals means there's criminal activity, right? So why not just go in and arrest them right off the jump? Right? Why go undercover if you already know they're criminals? Right? What's the thing that comes up for you if you think about why, if I know they're a criminal already?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, well, if we're just looking at it from a Sherlock Holmes point of view, it's like I need proof. I need to make sure I have evidence.
There it is, evidence, right? I need to know how this thing works behind closed doors. Mm-hmm. I need to know how it operates from within if I'm going to be able to take it down. Right? Because if you attack it from the outside, you may cut off an arm, it'll grow back, right? You may whatever. You're not going to really affect the the organism or the entity, if you will, right? So I bring that up to make this make sense. Like the way I see our lives is we're born into stories undercover, right? We're born into struggle. We're born into suffering. We're born into, we go through some certain experience in our lives that we didn't ask for, that wasn't our fault, right? But now we have a deeper understanding of this experience than anyone else could if you've not gone through it, right? So, and specifically when it comes to what I do, the way that I look at this is, I'm 37 now. So for the first 33, I was around 33 in that morning that I described. So for 33 years, I was undercover with shame. I went undercover with sexual abuse. I went undercover with sexuality struggles. I went undercover with substance abuse and using sex as, or believing that sex was my form of significance or validation in this world, because that's the message I received at such a young age. I was undercover with all of these things. And now that I've been undercover, we can expose the evidence, we can expose the inner workings, because we know how it operates behind closed doors. So the way that I see this is, first half of your life, that significant struggle that we've all endured, right? Whatever that is in your story, if you see it as you were undercover, acquiring evidence, right? And now you have enough to make your case, right? You can take this thing down. You know how to fight this, how to overcome it, how to leverage it, how to heal, whatever that may be. And once you have that, now you have something of significant value to offer the world, right? And this is where I get into the conversation around purpose, right? I truly believe that purpose this would be the formula, which is it's pain plus passion times safety equals purpose. And to make that make more sense, pain, it's being able to extract the wisdom from your deepest struggles, whatever that may have been. Right? Understanding the emotional themes, but taking the wisdom from it, the evidence, plus passion. Passion is just simply the shit you like to do. You love to work out. You love to run businesses. You love to coach. You love to paint, sing, whatever your thing is, right? That's a passion. But in my experience, purpose cannot be found or created inside of a passion, and without the wisdom of your deepest struggle. This is why I see that, people can become extremely successful at the things they love to do, only to feel more void at the end, right? Mm-hmm. It feels like a false summit. Like I got all the things I thought would make me feel purpose or fulfilled or what have you. And now what, right? Because they've used the passion to avoid versus invite the wisdom in, and then use the passion as a vehicle to deliver that wisdom to the world. Right. And then why I say time safety is, I don't think, it could be wrong, but I don't think anyone's ever OD'd on safety before. Right. When I say safety, I'm referring to, our physical survival, our protection. And safety in this context is what I call qualified support. And qualified, I'm not referring to your credentials, to your licenses, to your certifications, to all these things. In my opinion, those are tools. Right. But what I mean by qualified in this example is personal experience. Have you struggled with shame? Have you struggled with guilt, with feeling weak, feeling inferior? Have you struggled with these things that you're now inviting me to face and support me through? Right. So qualified support, this is why I say it's everything that we once believed disqualifies us. Those are the very things that are what actually make you highly qualified to support others in the way you are uniquely designed to support them. Right? And then I believe with those three things, wisdom, the vehicle being passion, and then the support, qualified support being mentorship, coaching, guidance, team, whatever that looks like. Now you get to create a life of purpose.
I want to jump in real quick and tell you about one of my favorite new products. And to start out, I want to ask you a question. If you had to follow your friends around who are not the healthiest in the world and see what they are doing, what would be the number one thing you would probably tell them to do to start? For most people, that's going to be drinking more water, right? This is something that we talk about all the time in health and fitness. It's almost as if we think of it as an afterthought now, because obviously water is so crucial. However, we oftentimes get this wrong. For example, did you know that when it comes to hydration, just drinking water can make things worse? Most people don't know this. Why? Partly because most people are over drinking water and under consuming the electrolytes that help water do its job. What we don't realize is that hydration is not just about water. It's about electrolytes, the minerals in there, as well as getting that water into the cells. And so you do not want to be over consuming water if you're not getting your electrolytes right. And this opens up a whole new discussion because most people are not getting their electrolytes right. For example, did you know that low sodium, too low sodium, is an issue? Just as much, if not more so, than high sodium. In other words, what we want if we're going to get the right electrolytes is to get the right amount of sodium and potassium and magnesium in the Goldilocks zone. We don't want too much. We don't want too little. We want it just right. This opens up a whole other thing here too, because people who are exercising, doing sauna therapies, doing low carb diets are disrupting and losing lots and lots of their electrolytes. For example, when insulin is not around in low carb diets, you will excrete lots of sodium. In other words, under that state, exercising, low carb diets, all these things, you actually need more sodium. And so if you're somebody who has been just drinking water, not paying attention to electrolytes, and also feeling fatigued, feeling like you're underperforming, not sleeping right, getting cramps, twitches, headaches, any of these things, then you are probably dealing with an electrolyte issue. This is where the product Element comes in. This product has been a game changer for me and many of my patients and clients. This is a rehydration electrolyte beverage, basically. It is a powder of electrolytes formulated with 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams magnesium without the added sugar and other nonsense that comes in beverages like Gatorade. This stuff is basically a rehydration beverage on steroids. It is the thing that is going to replenish your electrolytes in the right ratios, decrease fatigue, really correct chronic dehydration. And by the way, many people are dehydrating themselves, becoming hyponatremic, low sodium, when they're consuming too much water. You need your electrolytes on board, especially if you are someone who is losing lots of sodium and other electrolytes through low carb diets and lots of exercise. This is where Element comes in. Element is a new sponsor to the Next Level Human podcast. I cannot recommend this product enough. I have been using this stuff for months now, and I have immediately seen changes in my energy levels. I feel like I'm operating on a whole other level, and I have seen this as being the primary thing that people who have been using Element have been telling me, that their fatigue is getting better, especially fatigue that comes after very intense workouts that involve lots of sweating and lots of intense output from the nervous system. Please check out Element. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. DrinkElement.com. That's DrinkElement.com. DrinkElement.com, and let's get back to the show. Sorry to break in. I want to cover one of my sponsors, Organifi. Now, look, I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, and many of you who know me well know this, but shockingly, I cannot stand vegetables. I really do not like vegetables. I have not liked them since a child. I think it has something to do with my mom, who cooked everything just boiled everything, no salt, no fat, no taste, period. And so I developed an extreme dislike for almost all vegetables. And still to this day, I have a difficult time getting in my fruits and vegetables. Well, Organifi, started by my good friend Drew Canoli, who I've developed a relationship over the years, and I am really sort of tickled that we finally get to do this together with Organifi sponsoring the Next Level Human podcast. Drew is a next level human. Organifi is a next level human company. I can't say enough about them. I'm excited for them to be on board as a sponsor for the Next Level Human podcast. My favorite products, let me tell you about them. They have a ton, but I use 3 pretty much every day. I use Organifi Gold before I go to sleep. This is their turmeric tea based on sort of the old Ayurvedic golden milk. It is absolutely fantastic. It contains lots of different relaxing herbs, turmeric, tastes wonderful. And one of the things this has done for me is I had a very bad wine habit at night. It started out as just 1 glass of wine. Lately, it's turned into 2, 3, and sometimes a bottle. What I've done starting in 2021 is use Organifi. This is what I have in lieu of wine. And I sit there just like I used to sit with my wine, and I have the Organifi Gold. I also use the green and red juice powders. I have never liked greens and reds juices, period. These powders to me always tasted like swamp water. I use 1 scoop of the greens, 1 scoop of the reds first thing in the morning before my coffee. It has become a ritual over the last several years. It is fantastic. Those are the ones I use the most. Of course, they have a great line of protein products, and they have a new Organifi Gold chocolate, which I have not tried yet, but I cannot wait to try that because you all know I love cocoa powder and use it for lots of different things, for cravings and everything else. Check out Organifi, Organifi.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. Please take care of Organifi the same way they're taking care of the earth, doing amazing things as a company, and now taking care of the Next Level Human podcast so we can all be together and have these discussions. Organifi.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. Let's get back to the show. Here we go. I love that, man. It's so well said, too. Here's the thing that I want to ask you about, because one of the things that I can see with people who hear this, right? I'm sure if you're hearing this and you're in pain or you've had pain, one of the things I can imagine someone might be saying is like, well, how do I know, right? Like, so in this, man, I love the way you described this detective being undercover and figuring all this out. Mm-hmm. What was your, how did you finally start figuring this out? Like, because when you're in pain, right, you're kind of in survival mode. Mm-hmm. So was it time? Was it, did you go get mentors? Like, what happened? And to kind of get you started in here and give you a few ideas and just get the listener thinking, like for me, I kind of described a little bit how I see it. Let's say it's not so destructive that you need to go get counseling. 100%. Let's just say you're running into recurrent themes and patterns in your life. So for me, I go, if, there's this idea out there of toxic people. I don't necessarily love that way of thinking, because I just go, if someone is toxic and you keep exposing yourself to that toxicity, then you yourself are toxic, which kind of goes back to this thing of ownership, which I like. I loved the way sort of you described that. So for me, I go, if I see recurrent emotions over and over and over again, and then recurrent patterns, the same things keep happening in relationships, and then, sort of these obstacles that seem to recur again and again in my life. To me, I'm looking at these emotions, these patterns, and these obstacles as road signs in a sense. And sometimes, these road signs essentially make a left, make a left, make a left, make a left, and you find yourself in these circles, right? And so to me, I'm wondering how you see this. Like, how do we begin to spot what our dysfunctions might be, how we're still wrapped up in our pain, and then how can we escape? And I know it's a loaded question, but hopefully you can kind of get us thinking about certain directions, because I think once you're in that negative emotional spiral, it's very difficult for some people to kind of go, it's time to do something different. And I'm just curious how you see that and what your experience has been.
Yeah, and there's a couple places I'm gonna go with this, but first, I think determining something is negative or toxic, again, it's perception, right? If you talk to someone that's like, I absolutely love like drinking all the time, like and they genuinely, they're not just saying it, right? But they genuinely like, no, this is what I do. I love this, like whatever. It's like, okay, like I don't believe I'm gonna look at that and be like, it may not be the way that I want to live.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I may not want to spend a lot of time around you when you're drinking because of the way you act. Like, I don't know, but like, it's not my place to determine on your behalf what is negative or toxic if it's something that you're genuinely interested in. Right. But I think to really lay some foundation, I'd like to jump on the conversation for a second of, and I know you're familiar with this, but the nervous system, and more specifically, the part of the nervous system that's responsible for fight, flight, freeze, right? Mm-hmm. Which I know your audience has probably heard you and others talk about this, so there's probably some awareness. But if not, when I say fight, flight, freeze, it's referring to the ways that in which we respond to a real or perceived threat in our environments. Right. And I think the biggest thing here is the word perceived. Right. In most of our world, we're not in real threat. Right. Human civilization, our survival is more guaranteed now than it's ever been. Right. We don't have to hunt and gather and fend for ourselves and do these things that we once used to. We just Postmate something or, just, you can't sit with us, cancel culture, whatever this thing is that people are talking about now. Right. We go spend time with other people. So it's not. Our physical survival is more guaranteed than ever. But I think here's the thing that I think is most important. And this is also to answer your question. This is what helped me. So when I began to understand this, it created space for grace and forgiveness, right? Because I understood that I wasn't broken, but rather I was conditioned. And I believe this to be true for all of us. I don't believe anyone's broken. I believe you're conditioned. So if you understand your conditioning, well, now with that understanding, there's space. There's not judgment, but rather there can be curiosity. There can be forgiveness, right? So first is, the nervous system is hardwired to avoid two very specific things. The very first thing is pain. Right? Anything that causes the human being pain, if you allow it to persist, will eventually lead to harm or death. Right? Physical pain is pretty obvious. There's physical pain. If you allow it to continue, eventually harm or death, right? But then there's also emotional pain. Right? Emotional pain, chameleon, can often hide in plain sight. But how this works, if you allow emotional pain to persist, if you allow it will eventually lead to harm or death, often looking like disease, depression, or worst case scenario, suicide. Right? So that's one, pain. The second thing, and I think this part is extremely relative to the question you asked, which is the second thing we're hardwired to avoid at all costs is anything unknown. If you yourself has never experienced it, your nervous system is going to identify it as a threat to your survival. Why? If it's unfamiliar, it's unpredictable. If it's unpredictable, I don't know how to survive it. I don't know how to protect myself, right? Which is why we stay in patterns that we know consciously, logically, are not good for us or what's best for us. And we continue to do things that we identify as sabotage or, whatever. But in fact, anytime sabotage specifically, whatever behavior you identify as sabotage, right? Understand that behavior is not evidence of weakness. It's not evidence of brokenness or being inferior or not good enough, but rather that's evidence that your body is operating exactly how it was designed. That's evidence that you are working perfectly in alignment with your story, with your conditioning. And anything unfamiliar to you is going to be perceived as a threat. So naturally, you're going to sabotage, or I like to call recalibrate back into your familiar place, i.e. comfort zones. Right. So when we begin to do something we've never done, everything is unfamiliar. Right. This is where that qualified support piece comes in that equation. Right. For instance, if you don't mind me asking, where do you live? Where you come from?
I'm in Asheville, North Carolina right now.
Asheville. Love it. Mm-hmm. So I've never been to Asheville, right? Personally, been to Carolina a lot, but never Asheville. So if I land in Asheville right now and I call you and say, hey, Jade, I'm in town, I'm here. We're going to meet at your house. Right. What do you think would actually make me feel more comfortable or more safe? If you were to just say, all right, cool, here's my address and here's how to get here, pre-iPhone, right? You're just going to give me the checkpoints and the coordinates and all this thing, and I got to figure it out. Or you say, amazing, I'll be there in just a minute to pick you up.
Yeah, of course, the latter.
Right, the latter. So picking you up in reference to emotional work is being able to meet someone where they are. Are you in shame? Great. Let me go down there and connect with you in shame. I'm not going to judge it. We're not going to make shame wrong. We're just going to show up to it, get to know it. right? Be curious about it. And I'm going to share with you when I felt shame, right? And why, and how it affected me. So to create some understanding. So I'm going to meet you where you are and then lead you forward versus standing here on the other side of shame and saying, this is how you do it. Come here. Right? This is why books are great, but they don't fix everything because they tell you how, but it's not meeting you where you are. There's no one next to you saying like, I got you. It's like a father figure. Right. So this is why qualified support is imperative to healing anything, is to be in presence of or be connected with someone who gets it. You feel understood. You don't feel judged. Right. And I think that's also a big problem with a lot of traditional psychotherapy practices is, the relationship is there's a hierarchy, right? You're just another authority telling me what to do, right? Because they're, most of which, obviously this is a broad statement, are taught and trained to code, but not connect. Right? There's no co-regulation. I'm not allowed to share my personal story with you in a session if I'm under, those principles, because that affects the authority you may have and the advice I may give. Right? I'm too friendly. But in reality, it's the disconnection, it's the dysregulation that leaves me to, again, find more evidence that this isn't going to work. Right. So I don't know if that answered your question or brought up more.
I think it's a beautiful way to describe this. And I do think it's an interesting piece, right? Because if you're locked in these patterns, and you're sort of like, I don't want to leave my comfort zone, so you can see it. One of the best things, and we always sort of do this, you hear about it all the time, is that you have to, in my mind, you have to take that ownership, right? So we talked about that. You have to start paying very close attention. But then you need to start looking, in my mind, for the people who you want to be like. And that's, I think, the part where it's really interesting how that's such a critical point. At first, when you said it, I didn't quite get it until you started talking about this idea of like, you need these people to walk along with. It's funny. I have this, I've done these courses with men, different sort of camps where we go and we take on what I would call fear PRs. The whole point is doing a fear PR by yourself is virtually impossible. What you need someone there who's not nearly as afraid and gets it. So for example, if my fear PR is heights, but you've bungee jumped and you've jumped out of planes, that's yours too.
I just started sweating. I was like, if this man says heights, I swear to God, I'm declining the offer. So if yours is heights and mine really isn't, then I'm going to be your anchor and your support system. And when we go, let's say, first we'll just climb a hill and look over the edge. And then you're just like, that felt safe, right? So I'm walking you through that process. Then eventually we get to bungee jumping, maybe, and jumping out of an airplane. But I think it's such an important point, but it also simply means I need to show up and be in pattern with people who are different than me. And then also, luckily, hopefully you find these friends that essentially have been through that stuff as well. Like I love this idea. To me, one of the things is we oftentimes think of coaches and counselors that we need to find those and pay for them. And sometimes that's absolutely necessary and critical. But more often than not, those people are around you as friends. And if you don't have those types, to me, I'm like, you have to go and find those types. This is why, for me, we're built for connection. And it brings me to sort of the final thing sort of I'll get into here, because I do think we have to tease this out as the most important part of your work. And actually, this is where you and I sort of dovetail very, very, very much so. To me, if I could give everyone the gift, if I could just say, I want every human to feel this particular gift, I would give them the gift of purpose, because I think it achieves the feeling of fulfillment, which I think is the highest sort of emotional state of a human being, where it's this idea of like my achievement plus me making a difference for others. This is how I see sort of fulfillment. And so once we get to this place where we own our pain, in your story, you finally came out and just hit rock bottom and said, I will now own this, deal with the embarrassment, deal with all the stuff. Then you begin to sort of climb out of this, breaking, different patterns and using that pain, owning that pain. One of the most profound things you said in this conversation was just amazing, is that your story
was the thing that you wanted to take your life for. Now it is the thing that you want to live for, right? That you most live for. And I think that's the idea. If we could see this pain that we're carrying around, almost like, turtles carrying around a shell on their back, and we essentially see it as weighing us down, then we can see it as, this is a gift I can give to the world. I'm reminded of, I'm a child, I bring this up a lot, but I wonder if you know this, I'm a child of the 80s. So I don't know, you're 10 years younger than me. So do you remember the milk?
I was born in 84.
Faces? Okay, 84. So I was born in 72. So I was young coming up in the 80s. And I remember there would be these faces of missing children on milk cartons. And I went and looked later on in life on what the story was. This is a woman who lost her son, who got killed, raped, murdered, whatever. And worst thing that could happen to a parent. Now imagine what it would be like, right, Matthew, for me and you to go out there and talk to the milk lobby, talk to state legislatures, talk to the federal government without the internet, and do all this so that we can save other children. This to me is how the pain then turns into purpose. So in my mind, and I want to get your take on this and then we can begin wrapping up. But to me, I go, once you understand that actually perhaps the entire purpose of pain, right, then is so that you can do something for the world, and that to start looking at it in that way. So now I guess the question I'll ask you is, when did you get to that point? And with your clients, how do you help them get to that point, right? Because like you say, this whole thing is like what you like to do, plus your pain, plus these, people who are in support. This is how you get to purpose. So to me, though, what's that first step where you go, I get to choose, right? So how do you make that choice point? How did you, did you have the background already? I'm always curious on this. Were you into psychology and then you figured out, oh, this is what I'll specialize in? Or was it more like, hey, I had this pain and now I'm going to get into psychology? Because this to me is where the rubber meets the road for everyone who's in pain or had trauma. This is the choice point that we have to educate them on.
Yeah. And I'm going to blend both of these things that you brought up because I think they go hand in hand. So first is, again, it's our biology that's holding us back, not our mindset. Right. And we talked about the nervous system a little bit already, but I think the next thing to really understand is that as human beings, as animals, right, we're social creatures, right, that require the acceptance of our pack in order to increase our chances of physical survival. Right. If anyone's like, what do you mean by that? If you've ever seen a fight break out in a bar, the guy that's got a lot of friends is usually the one that's the loudest. Right. Because he feels the safest because it's pack mentality. But that same guy, when his boys go to the bathroom, probably not talking as loud. Right. Again, pack mentality. Right. It's not wrong. It's biology. So now I bring this up because most of us are born into environments that are, being controlled or dictated or influenced, however you want to describe it, by figures who are also terrified of their truths, terrified, don't understand their traumas, don't understand, and they are, projecting their fears onto others, right? Because as human beings, we do as we see, not as we're told. Right? Have you ever seen a communication broken down? They say it's like 93% of communications nonverbal. Right? 55 is body language, and I think it's 38, if my math is right, is tonality. Right? So over 90% of our language or what's being communicated is not even the words we're saying. Right? So what that means is we do what we see, not what we're told. Right. So when you are wanting to make the change, it's, something transitional character, right? Someone that comes through the bloodline, family system and says, for me, it's going to be different from this point forward. Right. You're going to disrupt that status quo. You're going to disrupt how the family operates, the things, how people view us, whatever it may be. And that disruption feels like abandonment. It feels it's basically triggers the, if I do this, I die response inside of us. Right. So identifying groups of individuals, even if you don't understand, like people are like, well, what if I just don't know? Well, who is it that you're drawn to? Who are you following online that really has your attention? Who are you admiring? Who you look up to? Right. And then just begin to pursue more people that are in alignment with, right? If you identify it as what you're interested in or would like to become, which is another thing I'd like to come back to for a second, is that word become. But when you identify the type of individual you want to become, and you identify those who are, operating as that type of person, leverage your biology. We are the product of the majority, or what do they say? Like the 5 people that we're the sum of the 5 that we spend the most time with. Well, imagine if you just started spending your time with other people doing different things. Biologically, you want to be accepted. You have to be accepted by the pack. So you're going to begin to perform as they do so that you can be accepted by them. Okay. So one of the most powerful hacks is spend time with those that are doing what you want to do. Not only are you going to absorb and learn, but biologically speaking, you're going to have to show up as they do, or else you won't be invited back. Right. And that feels like death. So we would rather step our game up than get kicked out. Right. So this is how you leverage, that part of ourselves. And this is, so going back to what you were saying before, I made a change. I didn't grow up. I grew up knowing, I had this intuition that I wanted to work with people at a deep level, but I didn't know what that meant. Right. And I originally pursued sports, and then I fell into entertainment. And then, my life took me in various ways. I used to say I always dated careers. Right. And it wasn't until I hit rock bottom. I was already studying psychology. I was already, going to university. I was already, reading the books and doing the things. But what I was also finding is at that time, I didn't have support. I had knowledge, but I didn't have support. So when I began to spiral, I would go to the things that I knew how to cope with the really intense emotions, the overwhelm, the energy, the anxiety, the shame, the whatever it is. And it was drugs, alcohol, and sex. Right. So I would just continue to go back to these places for relief, quite frankly. Right. Only to then, realize that it was those things that were also creating the cycle, right, that I couldn't seem to break. So it wasn't until I invested in support. And quite frankly, it was that morning changed everything.
Because, and integrated your pain too, right? It wasn't until you integrated your pain that you figured it out.
No holds bar. And the thing what changed and what I realized was important about support was, so that morning, one of the main things that my family did is they set up, without my knowledge, I was taken to the ER for emotional support. So I went to an acute trauma therapist, like on the spot. And to this day, I'll never know who she is. Like she could walk, into the screen. I'd be like, who's she? Like, no clue what this woman looks like. No idea what her name is. But I'll never forget the first thing she said after I shared my entire story. Because when I walked into her office, my whole thing was, fuck it. Like, here we are. Like, what do I have to lose? I'm going to give you everything, like all the shit. I'm going to give you all the dirt so you can look at me and say, you know what? You are that piece of shit. You're right. You're not good enough. Like, affirm this belief that I have, right? That led me to this morning. So I gave her everything. And the very first words out of her mouth were, no shit, you found cocaine. What were you supposed to do? And I was like, hold on. Like this, you're supposed to give me the 12 steps. You're supposed to get, you're supposed to lecture me. You're supposed to, reference all these books I've even read. Like I know the routine here, but instead she met me where I was. And it wasn't permission to go do the drugs. It wasn't like, no shit, go nuts. I know a guy. No, but she gave me grace. She gave me forgiveness. And then she went on to explain, how the drug triggers the same parts of the brain as sex and all these things. And no wonder. And then, so she gave me understanding, context, right? When I could receive it. But the biggest thing I got was forgiveness. I wasn't judged. I wasn't told this is immediately how you're going to get better starting today. It was, no, this is where we're at. She met me where I was. And then moving forward, what I realized was, I could share my deepest and darkest, and I'm still loved, still lovable. I'm still whatever. And if I was willing to go that far, again, I now no longer had the luxury of fear, still scared to death, by the way. And it doesn't mean fear doesn't exist, right? Hell, even having this conversation, to be very candid with you and the audience, I was terrified. Right? And I've followed your work. I've studied your style. I know your credentials. I know the level in which you go. It's imposter syndrome. I was like, this guy's going to expose me. This guy's going to whatever. But quite frankly, it's out of respect, because I have a great deal of respect for your work and what you do. But I bring that up to specifically say, when you start pursuing your purpose, from that day forward, you're never going to be in comfortable territory.
Yeah, that's
right.
for sure.
You're going to be, again, you're designed to avoid the unknown, but purpose lives in the unknown. Right.
And it's also like your life vest and your sword and your shield and your armor. It gives you something. You're not afraid, but you also feel like you have something to live and to die for.
Yeah. Or you're fucking terrified and you're like,
yeah,
I know how this goes if I don't do this. So let's try this out for a little bit and see what happens.
Yeah. And then you make the choice. And so I think, those of you who are listening to this conversation, like in the end, that's what it comes down to, right? Because still, and I think that last little bit there is interesting because still you have to make that choice sort of every day, right? Purpose is something I look at as like you choose purpose based off that. I have a slightly different a formula than yours, but I really like yours. So we'll just stick with yours, right? It's something that you build off of that formula. And then you have to choose it again and again. And again,
it's like
eventually, and eventually you go like this. Now you're the guy. This is what I think is beautiful about these stories, right? This is your own personal hero journey. Now you're the guy that someone comes in and you get to sort of be there and say, I'm here. I'll give you grace. I'm just going to meet you where you're at. And it's a beautiful thing. It's probably what drives you. And now it's interesting, right? Because that's why I get why your pain is the thing that you value the most in the world, because it's the thing that allows you to help people, because you couldn't speak to them without it and have them really feel like you get them.
Yeah. And I think it's important to like pain. The difference when someone's speaking from pain. When you speak from pain, you're speaking as a victim. A woe is me, right? But when you speak from perspective, you're sharing your understanding. I've been there. I get it, right? And I think that's important to identify. Is like when you see, when someone's speaking from pain and when someone's sharing something that was once painful.
Yeah. One of the things that just made me think of this, and I don't know why I'm going to share this, but I'll share this because sometimes things pop in your head and you're like, well, I just need to share it. And maybe someone in the audience, knows, oh, I know why you shared that. But one of the things that's interesting when we have these conversations, you go through this, you could have easily, like, I think you go right turn or left turn with pain. Some people go left turn and their whole life becomes about spreading that pain. And some people go right turn and their whole life comes healing that pain. And I do think this is really a good evil sort of thing. Like I think it's Ben Offer. He's one of the Christians that was in. I'm not Christian, by the way. I'm completely agnostic. But whoever is, I'm not religious. But I do love his quote. I think he was one of the Christians that stood up against Hitler during Hitler's reign. And one of the things he said that I think is just critical here. He says the point of evil is not to hurt you. The point of evil is to make you do more evil. And so in a sense, when each of us humans, when we become villains or victors, that's ultimately the choice of purpose, I think. And so that's why I would say that's why you love your pain so much, because it helped you take on the evil in the world. That's the point. Evil's done to you so that you can keep that evil being done to others. So any final thoughts for us, man? I mean, your wisdom is just absolutely amazing. And the way you show up for people, I can tell I know why you're a sought after expert in this space.
Well, I appreciate you. Looking at my board here, I have a bunch of things written on it. And there's two things that come up that I'll leave. And in reference to depression, both of these things are in reference to this emotional state we identify as depression. One of my favorite ways I've ever heard depression described was that depression is nothing more than denied expression.
That's beautiful.
And it rocked me. I was listening to a podcast and I stopped. I had to pause it. I'm like, hold up. Because you think about depressed, like you're always holding something, a truth, a desire, something, right? And the more you hold it, the more depressed we become, right? So depression is nothing more than denied expression. And then the thing I have written up here is a dream without courage creates depression.
Yeah, those are good, brother. Those are really good.
Right. And when I say courage, I would say this is the principle that you can live by. If anyone, I always like to leave things with a tool. And we've talked a lot about this, and the one tool that has been the most effective in my life, and it's as powerful as it is annoying, and it's annoying because it's powerful, right? And it's a simple question to ask yourself. Anytime you feel resistance, anytime you feel tempted, anytime you want to do something that is against the grain, whatever that looks like for you, ask yourself, what would courage do? Right? Because the one thing I found is that, going back to this word become, every single person I've ever encountered just wants to become someone they're proud of.
Absolutely.
And what I've found is, to be proud of yourself requires you to do more courageous things. So to become someone you're proud of, the question becomes, what would courage do? And then you just practice following it.
I love that. Matthew Paetz, thanks so much for being on. Stay on the line, brother. I'm gonna stop recording, and then me and you chat a little bit. But
let's do it.
Thanks so much. I know all of you listening. I hope you got a lot out of this. I certainly did.